All right, can everybody hear me with this?
Yes, sir.
Okay, wonderful. So just by way of introduction, my name is Blake Curry, and I'm a planner and urban designer with GAI Consultants. And a couple of years ago, we were hired by the county to do a master plan for the State Road 200 A1A corridor. And what's really interesting is how much has changed in the time period since we started this plan to today. There was, for instance, no COVID. The road was largely still under construction. That's why a lot of the pictures that you might see in the plan came from Google Street View, because we just couldn't get out there to send somebody out in the middle of the construction site to take photographs. But it's also interesting what hasn't changed. What hasn't changed is that growth is still happening, and I think we'll see through the presentation tonight, not growing is really not an option. The only option you have is what kind of form you grow in. And I think that's a big theme for the work that we did. So what I want to do tonight to kind of help us understand the exercises that the county staff has set up in the room is just kind of walk you through our plan and tell you what we were thinking, what we think some of the opportunities are, how the plan is set up, and then help you to understand how you fit in with being able to comment on some of these first steps that we have identified tonight. So I'm going to go through it. If you'll let me get through, if you have a question, we can handle those at the end. I might answer your question before we get done. So just sort of park it, and I'll go through the presentation. It's not going to take that long. I'd rather have time for everybody to continue to talk. So I think y'all have probably seen the maps on the wall, but you know the extent of the study area, all the way from the bridge on the east through Yulee and the heart of the corridor, past I-95 and all the way out past the Three River DRI. This is a long corridor, and it's got a lot of different characters throughout it, both physically and sort of the folks who live there. It's a very diverse place, but really the county wanted to do this because one thing that's obvious is that the pattern of development, as we've talked about here, that development pattern, it isn't really fiscally sustainable. It's not a net positive to the community. It's an old pattern. It doesn't really reflect the best practices, not even of the past 20 years, but maybe even a little longer than that, in design. And at the end of the day, it doesn't represent the interest of the community the way that it was laid out in the comprehensive plan. And so one thing I want you to understand is that we sometimes take this for granted because we're planners and we deal with this stuff every day. But when we do a plan, we usually refer back to the county's comprehensive plan. It's comprehensive because it covers a lot of ground, it covers the entire county, it covers a lot of topics. And it lays out some specific things that then a more detailed plan like this does, and tells the county and the community how to do the things that were in the comp plan. And then there's even some more things like zoning that get even more detailed, that refer to the plan and refer back to the comp plan. So this is a process. I'm not Nick Saban. I didn't trademark that, so I probably owe him money for saying that. But this is a process, and we have to understand that the sort of things we envision might take a while to actually come to fruition. But there's folks who are working on that every day to make that happen. So the first thing we did was obviously to listen and to learn, to sort of take stock of the corridor. And I talked about demographics. One of the things, and we have updated these demographics in the 2 years that it's taken to do the plan, and the trends have actually have been sustaining. One of the things that's really interesting is that yes, the corridor is growing, it's also getting older, and that's an interesting fact of the place that we are in time with the baby boom generation. But it also has effects on the way that we think about the corridor, the way that we think about livability within the corridor. How does, for instance, someone who is older get around and feel safe moving through the corridor, traversing, across it south to north or north to south to get from home to the grocery store, for instance. One of the things that we want to think about is the county's strategy to try to make this part of the county a place where people live and work. And so one of the things we would take a look at is, where are people working right now? Well, as you might expect, given the geography of the corridor, half the people are working in retail. And the thing to note about retail is that, if you can see the green dot, there's 3,300 people in retail jobs in the corridor. Those jobs are averaging less than $30,000 a year. And so we have sort of a disconnect between what it costs to maybe live in the corridor and what people who work in the corridor are making. Those two things, depending on how you draw the line, are maybe never going to match up totally, but it's something that we have to take into consideration as we think about how the place diversifies over time. The other really interesting thing to see is that there are about 11,000 people who live in the corridor, and when we say corridor, we're really talking about everywhere from sort of where we drew that line all the way up to the river, and basically the eastern portion of the county outside of Amelia Island. And so, there's about 11,000 people who live in that area but work elsewhere. And you can see that on the top. Where are they working? Well, a lot of them were working in Fernandina, which means they're going over the bridge every day. Another big chunk of them are working somewhere in the greater Jacksonville area. One of the goals would be, how can we figure out a way to keep those people and those jobs within the county? Now, one thing to note is that about 5,000 people are living somewhere else and working in this area. So that's a plus. And then it's really interesting, only about 1,300 people live and work in the corridor. So as we think about, for instance, how traffic moves, that's an important thing to consider. So we took stock of the real estate market in terms of rents and occupancy. And one of the things that I think you'll notice is, some of the rents per square foot, they're all trending upward. And some of that, for instance, retail, has to do with the fact that when the road was under construction, when Sabre 200 was under construction, landlords had to give maybe some rent concessions to get people to stay there through construction. But that's sort of worked its way through the system, and those are all trending upward. Occupancy is very, very strong. Even apartment occupancy, that's sort of a little bit of a red herring, because those go up and down with construction of new apartments. So right now it's a little lower. That's because there's some new apartments that are filling up, but when those fill up, that line will turn up again, and likely you'll start to see some more apartment construction play out that growth curve. Land use maps are always interesting to look at. Yellow and orange are usually residential. Red, commercial use. Purple, sort of office, gray, industrial, and green obviously is green. It's in a lot of cases here it's pine plantation or it's wetland, and I think what you notice is that there really are sort of three areas that are emerging, even though as a corridor it really kind of might feel like you're in one long strip, but you sort of see Amelia Concourse, Yulee, and then the interchange area with Wildlight really emerging as three separate and distinct places, which as we think about character is important to try to define some ways to build character in those locations. The other thing to notice is that there's a lot of yellow here that wants to get to red stuff here, and that has effects on roads, on things like utilities, because these are all utilizing services that we have to figure out a way to get down there. When we talk about roads, we can go to this one. What I really think is interesting and telling about the corridor is if you think about the fact that there's a bridge here, and there's not one that way, there's not one that way, and there's an interchange there, and there's one way up off the map, but between those 2 points, there really is just one way to get there. And it's one way for you and your car, it's one way for the log truck, everybody is pushed into that corridor. And one of the challenges, if you think back to the land use map and the way that there were lots of green corridors running north and south, is how do we get across that, and how do we utilize things like Pages Dairy Road in maybe a better way so that those can maybe be a little bit of a relief valve to State Road 200. As roads go, it's got capacity because we as a state just put a lot of money into it, but that capacity has a way of getting used and traffic growing to absorb it. That capacity really is sort of in a big east-west number. There's a more important number, which is how much each one of those intersections has capacity. So traffic engineers don't mind you driving on the road. They really hate if you make turns because that's what takes up capacity. And so you may have lots of capacity on the road, but if you lack it at certain intersections, that can have downstream effects, and that can change the way that we use it and even perceive the corridor. When we think about the corridor, just visually, one of the things that I think really jumps out is that it really is a barrier that lots of uses don't want to be close to. You're seeing maybe a little bit of a different thing happening down in Wildlight, where they're trying to get buildings to embrace the road a little bit, but it's a tough thing to do. Traffic is fast. If you're on a bike, you're right next to that fast traffic. We've got overhead utilities that impact the ability to do things like landscape on the street, and it really becomes a barrier between both sides of the road. Next one, we went through a process of engaging with some folks in the community, talking about what the corridor could look like, and I don't expect you to read any of this. It's in the plan if you would like to, but from there, I think the thing that is important is that we heard a lot of stuff, And some of it was the same, some of it was maybe a little nuanced, but what really came out of it were 5 big topics. And you'll see those topics ultimately reflected in the stations that we talk about tonight. One is, a real desire for a connection to the natural environment. The second one is a concern about the sustainability of the current development pattern. So what's the next generation of growth look like? The third, as I mentioned before, is a lack of transportation connectivity. So we have lots of roads, but we don't have much connectivity. The fourth is a desire for more identity and special character. So I think someone said, we're early on in the process in one of these public meetings, we're heading down the road toward being Landing Boulevard, and we really don't want to be that. And so we need to find some special character. And, the fifth was about resiliency. You see the wetlands and the floodplains. How do we make sure that this is a place that can adapt as those conditions ultimately change over time? So from that, we developed this vision and planning priorities. So the vision, if we go to the next slide, Holly, says that the State Road 200 A1A corridor will inspire identity, comfort, and future opportunity as a multifunctional, safe, and sustainable corridor that connects people to the places where they live, work, play, and stay. Very big aspirational goal. This is what we're trying to live up to. If we left it at this, it wouldn't do anything. It would just be sort of a flag waving in the wind. So in order to get there, we have a set of priorities that we need to think about. And the important thing about these priorities, as we'll talk about, is that there's some detail about things that we think you need to do that follow and talk about how we get to these priorities. 5 years from now, there's going to be opportunities that maybe nobody here was just smart enough to think about because it couldn't be an answer today. The priorities are there to be able to check back against to say, okay, this new road, for instance, is it really doing the connectivity that we need it to do? And if it is, then the plan can evolve and it can be part of the plan. If not, then these planning priorities have done their job in being a test for those new ideas. Go to the next one. So then we have a series of community character frameworks that talk about kind of the physical outcomes of the priorities. So in big terms, we're talking about how do we establish an entry to the corridor at the interchange, something that's a gateway that signals that this is, a place that loves itself and cares about the future and is different from any other interchange that you're going to see up and down I-95. How we think about how we redevelop Yulee. So some of the trends that you can see, we've got sort of the interchange on one end and Amelia Concourse on the other is sort of a barbell. It might be easy for Yulee to get left behind. And I think as a community with some not only historic character, but special place in the hearts and minds of lots of folks in the community, how we think about how that next generation of growth happens is important there. And so redeveloping Yulee is an important thing. Since I mentioned Amelia Concourse, thinking about how that area repositioned. So shopping centers, not too old, but we all know what the kind of growth trajectory of shopping centers is. We need to be out in front of that to start to have some standards so that as those places change, we can get their character more in line with the vision that we'll talk about here. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, these orange areas here that say transition, largely those are sort of about to be developed areas. So they're either homes, or maybe there's some older commercial uses, but those are places that I think character-wise we can get out in front of and have some special needs. So a lot of times the parcels aren't very deep. So if you could imagine a place where everything just has a curb cut off of State Road 200, that's not the environment that we're wanting to create. How do we get those places connected so that we can, share access, so that we can get a different relationship to the street than we do right now? Those transition areas are vitally important for the future of the corridor. So we laid out, in order to meet that big vision and implement those priorities in the way that we showed, we laid out 10 what we think of as targeted actions to do that. So one, and I think this has probably gotten a lot of discussion, is to implement a transect-based land development code. So I mentioned the idea of a comp plan and a master plan, and then there's zoning, sort of going down and level of, or going up in level of detail. When we think about the land development code, a C1 zone in one part of the county is exactly the same as a C1 zone in another part of the county, even though the character that you're trying to create may be vastly different in those two areas. Even though the surroundings may be vastly different, that zone is the same. So what a transect-based code is trying to do is get a little more detail and a little more specific about the kind of place that we're trying to create in order to implement a plan like this. So as we think about engaging a community that has everything from very rural places to very urban places, and what you're seeing happen with the healthcare uses down by Wildlight and the interchange, that has the opportunity to be a fairly urban place. If it's spread out and disconnected, it's not going to get there, and it's not going to achieve what it could if we don't talk about how more specifically we get there. So this is important. To support that in the plan, we've got things like some more detail about some basic things like, hey, it would be really good if we had a road that ran parallel to State Road 200 and access came from that road rather than from State Road 200. That would help a lot the conditions along that stretch of the corridor. So having a plan with things like that, so that we are not reactive when a developer comes in with an idea, but actually proactive to say, that's a fantastic idea, we love it, we need to see a street there so that we can make this connectivity happen and achieve a different future for the corridor. So that's one thing that transect land use code would do. It would also be specific about what we expect to see, for instance, roadway-wise. The county has road standards. These are maybe a little different from the ground up because we're talking about making sure we have livability components in it. Streets, sidewalks, trails, landscape, to have more specific standards about how those fit. If we go to the next slide. So the next of those actions was talking about improving non-motorized connectivity. So we spend a lot of time and effort thinking about how people get around in cars. and I'm sure we all drove to the meeting. That mode share, mode being how you get around, the mode share between cars and things like bikes and pedestrians has undergone a subtle shift over the past 10 years, and that shift is increasing. And what you really see is that it's, to borrow a phrase from Field of Dreams, like if you build it, they will come. If you build multi-use trails, people will use them. It's not a question of having bare concrete sitting out there and they don't get used. If you build them and you connect them to places that people want to go, they'll get used. And every time that gets used, it keeps somebody out of a car off the street. That's a win for everybody. So I show you these two pictures to give you examples of two different places in Florida. One being in Oviedo down in Central Florida, the other PGA Boulevard in South Florida, with not only, this one's kind of hard to see because it's behind this little knee wall, but not only wide multi-use trail facilities, but also destinations that are easy to get to where you don't have to cross a sea of asphalt on your bike or on foot to get there. That combination is what you need to get to get folks to actually use these facilities. And the important thing to note is that you can count the lanes. These are really big roads. A lot of times you see folks who say, yeah, we need to get trails, and they show you examples of nice little cute 2-lane roads. That's not State Road 200. State Road 200 is a big fast road, but there's examples of places where people have done this next to roads like that. So once we're in the center, I think it's important to note that the way folks build neighborhoods and shopping centers isn't the way they did 20 years ago. You can see that evolution. Up at what Rainier's doing at Wildlife. You can see it in places across this region as well as other places in Florida. Talking about getting livability elements in neighborhoods, and when we say livability elements, we mean connecting parks, simple things like street trees, getting an environment where it's okay for a building to, when we say engage the street, we mean like be right up next to it. Getting an environment where that can happen, those are vital, and that's something that I think gets tied back into that transect-based land development code. So the way we regulate development incorporates ideas so that you can have a more livable neighborhood when they get built. We also talked about branding, about identifying the corridor as some special place, and this notion historically of this Timber to Tides trail. Right now, if you look on Google, it probably says the Buccaneer Trail. It might say State Road 200. It might say A1A. Having some sort of blanket identification for the corridor as a place, so not the road, but the road and all the cool stuff that's around it, needs to be really advanced. So as I was walking in when I got here, I couldn't find the meeting, and the security guard was showing me where it was, and he said, "What's the meeting about?" I said, "State Road 200 master plan." He said, "Well, first," he said, "I hope that means you're not building anything new." And then he said, "Well, okay, maybe just no more strip centers or better strip centers." But then he did say, "Hey, what are y'all thinking about for natural areas?" And I thought, somebody who doesn't know anything about what we're doing, identifying, okay, the pattern of development probably is not what we might want to see, but also the natural areas are important in defining the character of the place. I thought that was really interesting for those to be the two things that he thought about. So what we've tried to do is identify lands that need to be protected for their character or for their role in building character in the community, so that the entire corridor wall to wall is not developed, but that you actually end up with these sort of green respites. For instance, here along the creek, as we're crossing that by the boat launch, it's actually developable right across the way. It would be vastly different character-wise if that parcel was developed, particularly in a pretty conventional way. It would fundamentally change the character of the corridor. I think it's important to identify those and think about how we protect it as a statement by the community. Another sort of big idea, and this is one that maybe you see, maybe you don't see, because a lot of it happens underground, but encouraging and in some cases facilitating a different way of handling stormwater. So instead of everything just going to the hole in the back of the property that has a fence around it, doing things like these sort of bioswale and low impact development stormwater planners, for instance. These can reduce the amount of land that we have to devote to stormwater ponds, which at the end of the day makes the whole place a little bit more developed. And if we could do that, maybe some of that area could be things like parks. Maybe, for instance, the way that we design stormwater ponds could be more of a amenity, or even go to the next one. Even the way that we think about stormwater within parking lots could be vastly different. There's some examples of this, around the region, and they work, and they're a benefit to the environment, because the water that comes out of here is cleaner than it needs to be. Next one. All right, and so the next couple of things I want to talk about are in the first three instances related to maybe the county as a landowner and or a developer for properties that they own. So, for instance, the old Yulee Junior High that is on 17. What's interesting is that the building itself is really kind of cool. There's lots of good bones to work with. There's also a big chunk of land, and one of the things that we looked at is there's some school board land, there's some county land that's along Page's Dairy, and so it's a subset of this. But if that land were actually developed in sort of a community fashion, maybe some residential, we looked at potentially doing a stormwater pond in the back that could be a master pond for everything within this area, so you make even the non-county stuff more developable. That could be a catalyst project that starts to move some things along in the corridor. So the next couple of slides, show, for instance, this is Page's Dairy. You can see the old gym right there. This is a county-owned site on the left. This is what that streetscape could look like. Maybe you get one of those stormwater planners in there so that you're not having to get things in the sewer and treat them elsewhere. That could start to build some character of place. Talking about the stormwater facility in the back, it could actually be a park. We're talking about some examples of places like you go to Claremont down in Central Florida, you see Victory Point Park that's right off of their downtown that they did. It's a stormwater facility that actually is where they host triathlons. It's the starting and ending point of their triathlon series. Great amenity, great catalyst for development to happen around it, and a way to make development easier because you don't have to worry about stormwater. It's taken care of in that area. So the administrative center, the Page Center, if that were to move over to right up the street here, what I think you have an opportunity there is a site surrounded by retail where maybe you could actually do some multifamily. Maybe you could do it in a little different fashion that starts to incorporate some public spaces. Maybe the architecture of it is something that is a little more vernacular rather than some of the kind of more generic stuff that you see. And one of the interesting things is that we did some pro forma analysis of these projects, and they actually pencil out. So this actually could be a net positive for the county as an owner, as well as a driver of community character and a change. One more of those facilities just up the street here. So this is William Burgess along that side. That's UF Health. That's State Route 200. So the old sheriff's facility there. One of the things you see is that you've got the hospital systems sort of planting their flags around here, establishing this as sort of a medical destination. Well, what if if a client of ours owned this, we would be thinking about, okay, well, you probably do some ALF there, some assisted living. You can probably do some other medical office sorts of uses. Maybe you could do some limited retail. And so, if you think about what can that look like, well, it could be sort of designed in a way that is more pedestrian friendly. The parking gets to the back. Maybe the stormwater facility is something that you put a trail around rather than putting a 6-foot high fence around. And again, that's something that could be a net positive on the books for the county. All right, so I tell you all that to get to the implementation, which is to say that there's about a dozen actions that we think probably need to happen pretty soon. You don't have to read these because they're on the sheets that are at each one of these tables. And so what we want to do, you want me to move them out, or do you want to move them out? So I'll let Thad explain sort of the process that we want to go through to kind of frame the discussion around each one. Phil, like state question. Oh, yeah. Sorry, that was premature. Before we get there, does anybody have any questions about the presentation? Yeah, watch it. 17 seconds.
Thank you, Blake. It's always very educational. We appreciate what Blake has done for us. I hope that helped give you a feel for the direction we're going in with this plan. Before I go any further, I would like to introduce Rita Robertson, our Public Information Officer for the county. And I definitely want to mention the chairperson of our Planning and Zoning Board, Linda Morris, is here. Thank you for coming in. So here's the plan. And we don't want to be rigid and bossy or anything, but I think that we've got enough people to make 2 tables. So I think we have a choice. We can either be informal, there will be one of us at each table and you can circulate around, or we can just you all can split up into 2 groups, basically 5 or 6 people in each group. We'll start with a table and just kind of cycle you through as quickly as we can. Since some people are their preference. Or, I'm going to tell you what to do. So we're going to have one table here, which is what we call future proof, and then we'll have connect communities over there with our county engineer handling it. And I will be here at this future proof, so everyone can kind of just divide up and pick your table to start.